The moors west of Hartencroft had not been kind to anything that autumn. The grass had gone pale and flattened, pressed down by 3 weeks of unbroken wind, and the sky above it held the particular gray of old pewter, not the gray of rain coming, but the gray of rain that had already come and left nothing improved by its arrival. The oaks along the road had surrendered their leaves early, as though they had calculated the season and found it not worth persisting in, and what remained on their branches was black and sparse and moved with a sound like paper tearing. The road itself was rutted and pale, cutting through the moor in a line that gave the impression of something drawn by a hand that had given up caring whether it was straight. It led eventually to a gate. The gate was iron. It had once been painted black, but the paint had gone the way of everything else at Ashenmore. Slowly, without ceremony, and without anyone watching closely enough to mark the moment it was finally gone. Beyond the gate, the estate announced itself in the language of long neglect. The gravel drive had softened into the earth around it, so that the wheels of the carriage did not crunch so much as press, each revolution leaving a track that filled almost immediately with brown water. On either side, the formal hedgerows had grown past formality into something closer to wilderness, tall, dark and shapeless at the top, as though they had spent years reaching toward a shape and simply stopped trying to find it. A sundial stood at the center of what had once been a parterre garden, its bronze face tilted at an angle that meant it told time to no one and nothing correctly. It was cracked along one edge, a clean diagonal split from the 12 o'clock position to the lower rim, and the crack had been there long enough that moss had taken residence in it, green and quiet and entirely indifferent to its surroundings. The house appeared at the end of the drive the way houses do when they are not glad to be approached, gradually, reluctantly revealing first one tower, then a roof line, then the full face of a facade that had been handsome once and remembered it without pleasure. The stone was the color of old bone. 3 of the upper windows were shuttered. A 4th had a shutter hanging loose on one hinge, knocking against the frame in the wind with the slow, patient rhythm of something with nowhere better to be. A raven sat on the roof ridge above the front door. It did not move when the carriage stopped. It regarded the carriage with the steady, measuring attention of something that had seen other carriages come and had noted what happened afterward. The woman who stepped down from the carriage did not look at the raven. She looked at the house with the same expression she had worn for most of the 3-day journey from London, which was to say, almost no expression at all. Her face was the kind of face that took effort to read, not because it was cold, but because she had learned over some years and at some cost to keep what moved across it from settling long enough to be named. She was perhaps 26. Her coat was dark and well-made, but not lavish. Her gloves were buttoned precisely. Her trunk had been strapped to the back of the carriage with a care that suggested she had checked the strapping herself before they departed, and had not entirely trusted the footman to have done it correctly. Her name was Alara. She had been the Duchess of Cavendish for 14 months. She stood for a moment in the gray afternoon light and looked at the house that her husband had sent her to manage. That was the word he had used. Manage. As though the ruin before her were simply an administrative matter rather than a message, and as though she were the sort of woman who could be made to feel the message without being told directly what it said. The housekeeper appeared at the front door before Alara had reached it. She was a small, dry woman named Mrs. Crail, who had the look of someone who had been waiting to deliver bad news for some time and had made her peace with the waiting. She gave a brief curtsy and held the door open with the manner of a person who has learned not to make promises about what lies on the other side of things. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Crail," Alara said. She stepped inside. She did not look back at the carriage or the gate or the moor or the sundial with its cracked face tilted at its useless angle. She had found in the past 14 months that looking back at things did not change them, and that what could not be changed was better met moving forward than standing still. The door closed behind her. The raven on the roof ridge shifted its weight from one foot to the other and said nothing. The marriage had been arranged in the manner of marriages that are called arrangements, without anyone feeling the need to explain what precisely has been arranged and in whose favor. Ilara's father had been a man of modest land and immodest debt, and the Duke of Cavendish had been a man of considerable title and a long-standing interest in consolidating the county's more scattered holdings into something that might be called an empire, if one were generous about the borders. The introduction had been made at a summer assembly. The courtship, such as it was, had lasted 6 weeks. The wedding had taken place on a Thursday in October, in a church that smelled of stone and old candles, with a guest list small enough to suggest either intimacy or haste, and was in fact neither. Aldrich Cavendish was 38 years old and handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, that is to say, in a way that called attention to itself before any warmth was invited to follow. He was tall, precise in his dress, and possessed of a voice that carried without being raised, which he had discovered early in life was far more effective than volume. He had married twice before Ilara. The first wife had died of a fever. The second had left for the continent under circumstances referred to in county society as a mutual agreement with the particular lightness of tone people use when they mean the opposite of what they are, saying Ilara had known none of this before the wedding. She had known it in fragments and suggestions by the end of the first month. She had not made a scene. She was not by nature or by training a woman who made scenes. What she did instead was observe, and file what she observed in the careful interior cabinet she had been maintaining since childhood, against the day when observation would become useful rather than merely necessary. She watched the Duke's habits of attention, who he looked at when he entered a room, who he looked away from, when his charm switched on and when it switched off, and what was underneath when it did. She noted the papers he locked away and the ones he left visible. She watched his face when money was mentioned, which was often and with a specificity that suggested the amounts were not academic. She had asked once about Ashenmore. They had been at dinner, just the two of them, and the question had come from something she had read in an old county directory, a brief mention of the estate as part of the Voss family holdings. Her mother's family, the branch that had produced one notable great-uncle who had lived alone for 40 years and died, so far as she had been told, without heirs. The Duke had looked up from his wine-glass with a quality of attention that was different from his usual quality, sharper and flatter at once. The way a window sometimes reflects light and shows you nothing of what is behind it. An old property, he had said. Somewhat dilapidated. Someone ought to manage it. She had not asked again. The morning he told her she was going came 6 weeks later. He had called her to his study, which was the room in the London house that smelled most strongly of him. Cedar, ink, and something underneath those two things that she could not name but associated with the particular confidence of men who have never yet been wrong about anything that mattered. He was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn immediately, and she understood that the not turning was its own kind of statement. "I have arranged for you to go to Ashenmore," he said. "The property needs attention. There is a housekeeper in place. You will find the accounts in poor order. I would ask that you review them and report to my solicitor at month's end." He turned then. He was perfectly composed. His expression was that of a man delivering a reasonable administrative instruction to a competent subordinate. And it was that quality, the reasonableness of it, the completeness of the performance, that told her more than the words had. She held his gaze. She kept her hands still at her sides. "Of course," she said. Something moved across his face that might, in a different kind of man, have been relief. In him it was subtler, a slight relaxation of the muscles around the jaw, as though a tension he had been carrying had been resolved without incident. "Good," he said. She had left the room without hurrying. She had gone upstairs and begun, methodically and without asking for assistance, to pack her own trunk. She had checked the strapping herself before the carriage departed. She had not looked back at the house in London. She had looked only forward, at the road, at whatever was at the end of it. The first week at Ashenmore was a study in the particular texture of a place left to itself for too long. The room smelled of damp stone and the faint sweet decay of wood beginning to go soft at the joints. The carpets in the main hall had faded to the color of dried herbs, their patterns surviving only as ghost shapes, suggestions of what had once been deliberate. The kitchen fire drew poorly. Mrs. Crail explained this with the economy of a woman who had long since run out of surprise at the things that did not work, naming the blocked flue in the tone others might use to name the weather. There was a gardener, an old man named Petch, who moved through the grounds with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had accepted that the work would outlast the worker, and found this not troubling. There was a housemaid barely 17 who went by the name of Bet, and had clearly never been told that her face could be read like a sentence, which was both her limitation and her considerable charm. Alara set herself to the accounts on the second day. She had asked for a fire in the study, a small room at the back of the house that looked out onto what had been a walled kitchen garden and was now a tangle of last summer's growth going to rot. And Mrs. Crail had built one without comment and retreated. The account books were where the Duke's solicitor had said they would be, in a cabinet behind the desk, and they were in the condition the Duke had described as poor. But poor in a way that, after an hour of careful reading, began to seem like something more specific than neglect. The figures did not match. Not in the careless way of figures kept by someone inattentive, where mistakes are random and distributed without pattern. These mismatches had a direction. Income recorded, then quietly revised downward in a subsequent entry. Rental receipts from the estate's 3 tenant farms that seemed, when she traced them forward and backward through the years, to have been consistently underreported. The difference was not large in any single entry. Accumulated across 6 years of ledger entries, it was not small at all. She noted it. She filed it in the interior cabinet. She closed the account books and put them back precisely as she had found them. On the 4th day, she walked the full perimeter of the house. The east wing was locked, not merely closed but padlocked at the corridor entrance, with a padlock that was newer than anything else in the building, its brass still bright and particular against the age of everything surrounding it. She stood before it for a moment, one hand resting on the bolt above the padlock, and then walked on without trying it. She found the east wing's exterior on her walk. Tall windows shuttered from inside. A separate entrance at the far end with a similar padlock. And she looked at those shuttered windows for a measured time and then looked away. At the walled garden, at the bare November sky above the roof line, at the raven which had appeared again on the garden wall with its patient, assessing air. "What do you make of it?" she said to the raven. Not quite aloud, and not quite to herself, but somewhere between the two. The raven looked at her with one eye, then the other, in the sideways manner of its kind. Mrs. Crail was waiting at the kitchen door when Alara came back inside. Alara looked at her and said simply, "The east wing." Mrs. Crail folded her hands in front of her in a gesture that was not quite readiness and not quite reluctance, but somewhere precisely between them. "It's been locked since I came to the post," she said. 7 years ago, that would be. "The instructions I received were clear. The wing is not to be opened or entered." "I was given no reason." "From whom did you receive those instructions?" A brief pause, the length of someone deciding whether the truth is the same as disloyalty. "The Duke's solicitor, Your Grace." Alara nodded slowly and moved toward warmth. She did not ask the next question yet, because she had learned that some questions were best held for the moment when the answer was already almost visible, so that the question itself became confirmation rather than beginning. The east wing yielded on the 18th day of her residence. She had sent a letter to a locksmith in Hartencroft explaining that she was the Duchess of Cavendish, that the estate was hers to manage, and that a locked wing was inconsistent with a proper accounting of the property's condition. The locksmith arrived, opened the padlock in 11 minutes, and departed without opinion. Mrs. Crail stood at the far end of the corridor and watched, and did not come closer. Alara opened the wing alone. The corridor inside was cold in the specific way of rooms that have been sealed, not merely chilly but airless, as if time itself had slowed without the ordinary circulation of a lived-in space. She moved along the corridor methodically, opening each door as she came to it. Most rooms held furniture under holland covers, pale shapes in the shuttered dimness. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room whose wardrobe still held a row of dresses that had gone stiff with age. A woman's dresses in a style 2 decades old, in the colors of someone who had dressed with taste and been left, it seemed, without any ceremony worth marking. The last room at the end of the corridor was a study. It held a desk, a bookcase, and 4 trunks stacked against the far wall, each locked, each marked on the side, in a hand that was not the Duke's, with a single letter. She stood very still in the cold room and looked at that letter and felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in some weeks, not excitement, which was too shallow a word, but a controlled and sharpening attention. The way a lens brought to focus changes not the subject but the quality of the seeing. V was for Voss, her mother's family, her great-uncle's initial. She found the ledgers in the desk, not the estate's account books, which were upstairs in the main house, but older books, privately kept, in a hand that was meticulous and slightly cramped. She sat down in the cold study in her coat and her gloves and read for 2 hours. The fire in the main house would have gone low by now. She did not notice. The ledgers were records of a mind that had kept close account of everything it valued. The estate's management in fine detail across 42 years. The tenants' names, their situations, their arrears forgiven, and why. The cost of the south roof repair in the dry summer of 1 year. The planting calendar for the kitchen garden maintained in a consistent hand that grew only slightly shakier in the final entries. And at the back of the last ledger, folded into the inner cover in the manner of something preserved rather than hidden, a letter. It began, "To whoever finds this and has cause to." She read it in full. Then she sat in the cold and the dimness and the particular silence of a room that has held a secret long enough for the secret to become structural, load-bearing, invisible only because nothing had yet been removed to reveal what it was holding up. The letter was from her great-uncle, addressed to no one and to her simultaneously, as letters written in solitude often are. He had known, he wrote, that there were those who would be interested in what he left behind, and for that reason he had arranged his most important document with care. Not hidden, he wrote. Hidden things are found by the wrong people as often as the right ones. Placed, with something that keeps better time than most and was always meant to outlast the man who owned it. She would know it when she stood before it. She folded the letter as she had found it and placed it inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel it with each breath. She went back to the main house. She asked Bet to bring tea. She sat by the study fire and drank it with steady hands and did not allow herself to move to the next thought until the cup was empty, because she had found that major things required a certain stillness at their arrival. If you rushed to meet them in shallow water, something would run aground. In London, she was certain. The Duke was having dinner with someone important. She hoped he was enjoying it. Lady Osmond arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, unannounced and entirely unconcerned about being so, in a carriage that was 10 years old and moved with the confidence of one that knew its own worth. She was perhaps 60, with a face that had been handsome in youth and had since become something better, particular and weathered, and entirely uninterested in softening itself for anyone's comfort. She wore a great deal of dark green and carried a walking stick she did not appear to need. "I heard someone had finally come to the place," she said, when Mrs. Crail had shown her in and retreated to a cautious distance. "I've been waiting to see what kind of person they'd send." "You're not what I expected. What did you expect?" Ilara said, someone easily frightened. "There are stories about this estate, you know. Dreadful ones. A curse on the bloodline, the ghost of the previous owner, livestock gone missing in the south field." Lady Osmond settled herself into the chair across from Ilara with the efficiency of someone who has been sitting down in other people's chairs for 60 years and sees no reason to be tentative about it. All nonsense, of course. I've lived 4 miles from this gate for 30 years, and the most supernatural thing I've observed here is the speed at which a perfectly good property can be made to appear worthless when someone with an interest in its appearing worthless tells enough people enough stories. Ilara was still. "You knew the previous owner?" "Edmund Voss." Lady Osmond said the name with the particular weight of someone who has been waiting a long time for the opportunity to say it properly. "Your great-uncle, unless I'm much mistaken, which I am not. He was a private man. Eccentric, people said, because he had no patience for society and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Brilliant, those of us who actually knew him said, which was a smaller number but a better one." She paused, turning her walking stick once between her palms. "He spoke of you." "Not often, but he did." Ilara said nothing. She was aware of the letter inside her coat. "He had no patience for what he called arranged inheritances." Lady Osmond continued, "by which he meant titles absorbing land that ought to go to blood. He had very strong feelings on the subject. He expressed them to me more than once, usually in the garden, which he loved considerably more than he loved most people." She looked at Ilara with the steady attention of someone delivering information they have been holding for a purpose. "He made provision, you understand. He was careful about it. He told me only that it was done, and that the right person would find it when the time was correct, and that he trusted the time would eventually be correct even if he did not live to see it. When did he die? Ilara asked. 7 years ago this past September, 7 years. The age of the padlock. The age of Mrs. Crale's instructions. Lady Osmond watched her work through it and said nothing, because she was the kind of woman who understood that some conclusions needed to arrive under their own power to be properly believed. You said the stories about the curse began, Ilara said carefully. Do you know when they began? 7 years ago, Lady Osmond said. Give or take a month. She rose with the ease of someone whose body has not yet received the news about age. I imagine you have things to attend to. I wanted to see the kind of person who would come. Now I have seen. She moved toward the door, then paused with the air of someone who has remembered something they intended to forget. There is a garden here that Edmund loved. In the center of it is something he was very fond of. He used to say it was the only honest thing on the property because it never pretended to know what time it was when it didn't. A brief pause. He had it repaired once and then cracked again in a frost the following winter. He didn't repair it a second time. He said he'd leave that for whoever came after him. She left before Ilara could answer. The sundial stood in the garden as it always had, tilted and cracked and moss-covered and entirely indifferent to the cold gray light of a November afternoon. Ilara stood before it for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the air. Petch was somewhere behind her, raking at the frozen ground, and the sound of it was the only sound besides the wind. She crouched and placed both hands on the base of the sundial. The stone was rougher than it looked. She pressed along the seam where the bronze post met the stone plinth and worked her way around the circumference. And on the north side, behind a crust of lichen, she found it, a small iron door, no larger than a paperback volume, set flush with the stone and sealed with a latch that had stiffened with age and cold and required both hands and more force than she expected. It opened. Inside was a lead-lined cavity the size of a small box. Within the lead lining, wrapped in a square of treated oilcloth that had kept the moisture perfectly out, was a folded document. She took it out with hands that she made steady. This was a decision. She made it again and again every few seconds without rest. She stood and unfolded the document in the cold garden light. It was a will. Properly witnessed, properly dated, bearing the seal of a firm of solicitors in Hartencroft and the signature of Edmund Voss, written in the cramped, meticulous hand she now recognized from the ledgers. It had been drawn up in the spring of the year of his death. It conveyed the estate of Ashenmore in its entirety, the house, the grounds, the 3 tenant farms, and all rental income derived therefrom, to Ilara Marguerite Voss, his great niece, to be held by her in full and without encumbrance, her name. Her name, written there in a dead man's hand 7 years before she had thought to look for it, before she had been sent here to be gotten rid of, before she had become the Duchess of Cavendish or understood what that title had cost her. She stood in the garden for a long time. The raven landed on the sundial's post above her head and looked down at her with one bright eye. No, she said quietly. She folded the document with extreme care and placed it inside her coat beside her great-uncle's, led her and walked back toward the house with the steady, measured pace of a woman who has just found everything she needed and intends to be very careful about what she does next. Mr. Hartwell, of Hartwell & Sons Solicitors, practiced from a small office above a bookshop on Hartencroft's main street, and he had the look of a man who had sat in that office for a very long time and had seen most of what could be brought through the door. He was thin, precise, and wore his spectacles on the end of his nose in a manner that suggested they had been there so long they had stopped being something he put on and become simply part of his face. He read the will twice, set it down, and read it once more. "This is properly executed," he said. "Yes," Ilara said, "witnessed by 2 parties, both of whom I can confirm were associates of Mr. Voss in good standing." He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with the deliberate slowness of someone organizing their thoughts. "Your Grace, are you aware that this document predates your marriage by approximately 14 months? "I am aware," she said, "and that as such, the estate of Ashenmore passed to you by right of inheritance before any marital arrangement could affect its disposition?" "I suspected as much. I wanted your confirmation." He put his spectacles back on. He looked at her over them with the expression of a man who has worked in the law long enough to know that the most interesting cases always begin with someone sitting very calmly across from him and saying they merely wanted confirmation. "There is also the matter," he said carefully, "of the estate's accounts over the past 7 years, which I understand you have had occasion to review." "I have." "And did you find anything that concerned you?" "I found a consistent discrepancy between income generated and income recorded," Alara said. "I have made a full notation of the figures. I can provide them to you." He nodded once, precisely. "I would ask that you do." He folded his hands on the desk. "There is a matter you may be unaware of. Lord Pemberton, the county magistrate, has been conducting a review of certain financial arrangements in this district for some months. The review began with concerns about a different matter entirely, but the scope has widened. I am not at liberty to say more than that. I mention it only because it is possible that your notations and his inquiry may, as it were, find themselves pointed in the same direction." Ilara sat with that for a moment. "I see," she said. "Shall I proceed with establishing your formal claim to Ashenmore?" "Yes," she said. "Quietly, please." Promptly, but quietly. He nodded again, and she understood from his expression that quietly and promptly were the conditions he preferred for most things, and that she had chosen her solicitor correctly. She drove back to Ashenmore in the early afternoon and sat in the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house, and drank tea with Mrs. Crail and told her that certain legal matters were being attended to and that nothing would change in the running of the house in the interim. Mrs. Crail received this information with the carefully composed expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to happen for 7 years and is not surprised that it is finally happening, only relieved to know the direction it is moving in. "There's something I should have told you sooner, Your Grace," Mrs. Crail said, after a silence long enough to have its own quality. "When Mr. Voss died, before the solicitor came to give me my instructions about the East Wing, Mr. Voss called me in, the week before the end. He was very clear in his mind even then. He said—" She stopped, restarted. "He said that if anyone ever came to this house with his blood in them and his eyes open, they were to be helped. Not obviously. Just helped." Alara looked at her. "I left the account books where they were," Mrs. Crail said. "All of them. I did not send the East Wing key to London when they wrote and asked for it. I said it was lost." "Thank you," Alara said. It was not a large thing to say. It was the largest thing available. The restoration of Ashenmore did not announce itself. It simply began, the way living things begin, without ceremony and without an audience, because the work itself was the point rather than the announcement of it. The blocked flue was cleared and the kitchen fire drew correctly for the first time in what Petch estimated was 4 winters. The loose shutter on the upper window was rehung. The tenant farmers, 3 families who had been paying their rents for 6 years to an account that fed something other than the estate they worked, were called to the house and told plainly that the management of Ashenmore was changing, that arrears would be reviewed with fairness, and that any improvements they had been waiting for would be attended to as funds allowed. They came to the house with the wariness of people who have learned not to trust what is offered before they understand what is wanted in return. They left with the slightly altered expressions of people who have received something straightforward and are still waiting for the complication that does not come. Bet learned to manage the upper floors. Petch found 2 additional hands willing to work for honest wages and began on the kitchen garden. Mrs. Crail expanded the household accounts with the quiet satisfaction of someone watering a plant that had been thirsty for a very long time. Lord Pemberton arrived. In the first week of December, he was a large, deliberate man in his late 50s, built along the lines of someone who had once been actively physical and had redirected that energy entirely into precision of thought. He came to the house formally with a card sent ahead and sat across from Alara in the restored study, the fire drawing well now, the carpet beaten and returned, the shelves dusted, and laid his cards on the table with the directness of a man who had spent enough time in the law to know that circling a subject wasted everyone's time. "I have been examining the financial arrangements of the Duke of Cavendish as they pertain to holdings in this county," he said. "I will not tell you what prompted the examination, but I will tell you that in the course of it I have encountered figures that do not reconcile with records in this district's land registry. specifically as they pertain to 3 tenant farms on the Ashenmore estate. He looked at her steadily. Your Grace, I understand you have recently had occasion to review the estate's accounts. I have. I would be grateful for any observations you are willing to share. She shared them. All of them, in order, with the notations she had prepared for Mr. Hartwell, and a second copy she had prepared because she had suspected something like this conversation might come. Lord Pemberton read through them without expression. He made 2 notes. He folded the papers and put them in his case. There is also a matter of a will, Alara said. She told him about that too. He listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who understood that the shape of a thing only became clear if you let it finish. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have you been at Ashenmore, Your Grace? 6 weeks tomorrow. He looked around the study, at the fire, at the order of it, at the copies of the account notations she had produced without being asked. I will be frank, he said. The Duke's position in London is not as secure as it was 6 months ago. His investments in 2 railway concerns have not performed as represented. There are questions in certain quarters about the manner in which those representations were made. He paused. I mention this not to satisfy curiosity, but because it is relevant to the question of how aggressively he may respond when the matters we have discussed today begin to move formally. I'm not easily frightened, Alara said. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I see that. December passed and January came, and the work of Ashenmore continued in the way that honest work continues, not dramatically, not in large sudden leaps, but in the accumulation of small things done correctly and consistently until the sum of them became something that could be seen. The south roof, which had been admitting weather at one corner, was repaired. The parterre garden was cut back to the discipline it had once maintained. The sundial was still cracked, but Alara had engaged a craftsman from Hartencroft to assess it, and he had come and studied it and said it could be repaired and given her a date. In London, the Duke of Cavendish was not having a good winter. This was known to her in fragments. Through Lady Osmond, who had connections to county society that functioned with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and through Mr. Hartwell, whose firm had begun receiving correspondence from the Duke's London solicitors on the matter of Ashenmore that was, as Hartwell described it with precise understatement, becoming increasingly urgent in its tone. The railway venture had collapsed entirely in December. A second financial arrangement, the nature of which the Duke had kept carefully separated from his public accounts, had attracted the attention of people whose attention he had specifically hoped to avoid. He had, it seemed, overextended himself in several directions simultaneously and discovered, as such men eventually do, that extensions made in different directions do not support each other but rather pull each other down. He arrived at Ashenmore on a Wednesday morning in February without writing ahead. He came in the same carriage that had brought Alara 3 months earlier, or one very like it, and he came alone, which was unusual for him and suggested something she noted and filed without comment. She was in the garden when the carriage came through the gate. She had taken to working outside in the mornings, not because the cold was pleasant, but because the cold was real, and she had found that real things, even uncomfortable ones, had a clarifying quality that she valued. She heard the wheels on the drive and turned, and she watched the carriage come toward the house, and she did not move from where she stood. He stepped down and saw her immediately. There was a moment, very brief, almost invisible, in which something crossed his face that was not part of his usual composition. Then the composition returned. He walked toward her across the garden with the particular ease of a man reclaiming territory he considers naturally his, and as he came, she had the clear-eyed understanding that this ease was a performance, and that behind it something was working very hard. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked around the garden, at the cut hedgerows, at the cleared paths, at the kitchen window where Bet's face could be briefly seen before it was rapidly removed. He looked at the sundial, still tilted and cracked with its patient moss. Then he looked at her. You have been busy, he said. I have been managing the property, Alara said. As instructed. A pause, thin as paper. It looks well. It is getting there. He turned and looked at the house, and she watched him look at it, at the reglazed windows, the rehung shutter, the stone facade that had been quietly pointed where the mortar had crumbled. He took longer looking at it than he had intended to. She waited. I thought we might speak, he said. "Of course," she said. "Come inside." She showed him to the restored study, which she had arranged with the cool intentionality of someone who has thought about this room as a stage before the actors arrived. She sat behind the desk. She gestured to the chair across from her, which was the same chair she had sat in when Lord Pemberton visited, and she thought he understood this and did not like it, though his face said nothing of the kind. He began with the approach of someone who has prepared 3 strategies and has not yet decided which to employ, beginning in the middle, in a space that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, testing the ground. He said that matters in London were in a period of transition. He said he had been giving thought to Ashmore's future and believed it might benefit from more direct oversight. He said, with an ease that almost concealed the thing beneath it, that he had wondered whether she might consider returning to London now that the immediate work was in hand. She let him finish. Then she opened the desk drawer and placed on the desk, in sequence, 3 documents: the will, her notations on the account discrepancies, and a letter from Hartwell confirming the legal claim's formal registration with the county. She did not say anything. She let him read, because some things had to be arrived at under their own power to be properly believed. She watched him read. She watched the performance, which was very good, truly very good, she gave him that, begin to find its load-bearing elements failing one by one. Not in collapse, not in anything loud or sudden, but in the slow way that composure fails when a man understands, for the first time in perhaps a long time, that he is not the most prepared person in the room. "This will," he said finally. His voice was level. The levelness was the effort now rather than the manner. "Is valid," she said. Mr. Hartwell confirmed it. "Lord Pemberton has a copy," the name landed. She saw it land. "Ilara." He said her name, and in the saying of it she heard for the first time in 14 months something that might in other circumstances have been real. Whether it was, she could not say. She did not think it mattered. "The tenant accounts will be a separate matter," she said, "between Hartwell's firm and Lord Pemberton's office. I am not required to be involved in that element, and I do not intend to be. That is between you and the county." She folded her hands on the desk. "Ashmore is mine, Aldrich. It was mine before our marriage. It is mine now. Nothing that has happened in the past 14 months changes what was written in that document before any of it began." He was quiet for a very long time. The fire crackled. Outside the study window, a raven landed on the garden wall and regarded the house with its usual unhurried assessment. "What do you intend?" he said at last. "To live here," she said. "To manage the property. To do the work that was always mine to do." He rose. He was still, she noted, very well dressed. Whatever else was falling apart, he had not yet stopped maintaining the surface, and she thought that said something true about him, that the exterior would be the last thing he let go, because the exterior was what he had always trusted most. "I will need time," he said. "For what is between you and Lord Pemberton," she said. "I imagine you will have whatever time the county allows you." He left without further conversation. She listened to the carriage on the drive and then did not listen to it any more, because some departures are worth marking and some are simply the sound of what is finished being finished. A year passed. This is not a phrase meant to rush over what occurred in it, but simply to acknowledge that certain things require a year, and the year was necessary. And within it, the things that needed to happen happened with the patience and weight of things that had been a long time in preparation. Lord Pemberton's inquiry reached its conclusion in the spring. The Duke's financial arrangements, laid open across several months of methodical examination, proved to be the kind of arrangements that people in the county spoke of afterward with the careful language people use for disasters they privately saw coming. The railway misrepresentations were adjudicated. The estate accounts were settled, and the settlement reduced the Duke of Cavendish's holdings to a narrow strip of what they had been. He retained his title, which was worth exactly as much as a title is worth when it is no longer attached to anything that can be exchanged for bread or lodging, which is to say, considerably less than it once appeared. He sublet his London house in June. He sold the carriage in August. He spent the autumn in rooms above a coaching inn in a town nobody wrote about in county directories, and the winter found him writing letters. One of the letters came to Ashmore, addressed to her Grace in a hand that was still precise and had not allowed itself to become otherwise. Elara read it by the study fire. On a January morning, with the winter light coming through the windows that were fully glazed now and had been for 8 months. The letter was not long. It was, in its way, the most honest thing he had written to her in 14 months of marriage, which may have been because there was nothing left to perform for, or because performing for no one eventually stops being worth the effort. He wrote that he was in difficult circumstances. He wrote that he required accommodation for an unspecified period, while various matters were attended to. He wrote, and this was the sentence she read twice, that he understood if she declined, and that he would not consider it other than her right. She sat with the letter for a time. The fire made its sounds. Outside the window, the parterre garden lay under a thin coat of frost, and the sundial stood at the center of it, repaired now, its cracks sealed with new bronze, its face reseated and level, the shadow of its gnomon falling correctly across the numerals for the first time in years. The craftsman had come in November and done the work in an afternoon, and Petch had stood in the garden doorway and watched with the expression of a man witnessing something that has been a long time in being put right. Elara wrote her reply at the desk, in a hand that had always been cleaner than his. She had one room available. The rate was the going rate. He was welcome for as long as his situation required, on the understanding that the estate's management was hers and that arrangements within the house were hers to determine. She signed it with her family name, her mother's name, the name that was carved in the will in the desk drawer, the name that was registered with the county, the name she had been before she was the Duchess of anything, which was also, she had discovered, the name that mattered most. He arrived on a Thursday in February, in a hired carriage that was perfectly adequate and made no impressions in either direction. Elara was in the entrance hall when he came in, standing, not waiting, because there is a distinction between the two that has everything to do with which party holds the door. He was still well dressed. He came in with his single trunk and his title, and the careful composure of a man who has rebuilt his exterior to the last and holds it now as the one remaining thing that cannot be taken. He stopped inside the threshold and looked at the hall, at the polished floor, at the repaired plasterwork, at the candles burning in fixtures that had been rebrassed in the autumn. And he did not say anything for a moment, because there was too much to say and no performance adequate to say it with. "Your room is on the second floor," Elara said. "Mrs. Crail will show you up." He looked at her. She looked back with the face she had always kept steady, the face that did not let what moved across it settle long enough to be named, because she was not ready to name it yet and perhaps never would be, and perhaps that was all right. "Thank you," he said. It was the plainest thing she had ever heard him say. She thought it might even be true. Mrs. Crail appeared and showed him up the stairs. Elara waited until his footsteps had reached the second floor, and then she put on her coat and her precisely buttoned gloves and went out into the garden. The frost was still on the ground. Her breath made small clouds in the gray February light. She stood before the sundial and looked at it, repaired, level, honest, the shadow on its face, marking the morning hour with the patience of something that has always understood that time moves in one direction and that this is not a complaint but simply a fact worth knowing. The raven landed on the bronze gnomon above the face and looked down at her. She did not say anything to it this time. There was nothing left to say that the garden did not already know. She stood in the cold morning and breathed, and the estate breathed around her, and the sundial told the hour with the quiet accuracy of something that had been waiting a long time to do the one thing it was made for, and was in no hurry now that it finally could.